3 signatures, 3 governments, 1 declaration that just ended 60 years of Western control over an entire region. No warning, no negotiation, just severance. And while Europe scrambles to understand what just happened, the Sahel isn't waiting for approval. It's already being rebuilt by powers the West spent decades trying to contain. Russian air defense systems now protect capitals that French jets once threatened. Turkish mining deals give Africans majority ownership of their own gold. Chinese infrastructure is replacing roads the World Bank refused to fund. This isn't a crisis. It's a model. And if it works, the rest of Africa is watching, ready to replicate what the Sahel just proved is possible. On January 29, 2025, the foreign ministers of Mali and Burkina Faso stood before cameras in Bamako and issued a joint declaration that Western capitals are still struggling to process. They didn't negotiate. They didn't request dialogue. They announced that France, and by extension, the broader Western sphere of influence, no longer holds political, military, or economic legitimacy in the Sahel. This wasn't diplomacy. It was severance. For over 6 decades, the Sahel operated under a framework that Paris designed and maintained. French troops rotated through regional bases. French corporations extracted uranium, gold, and phosphates under favorable terms. Sahelian currencies remained pegged to structures controlled in part by the French treasury. Political leaders who challenged this order rarely lasted long. Those who cooperated were shielded, armed, and financed. It was a system built on dependence, and it worked until it didn't. What changed wasn't just leadership. It was legitimacy. The populations of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger watched French forces fail to stop jihadist expansion. They saw Western-backed governments collapse under corruption and incompetence. They witnessed their resources leave while poverty deepened. And when military officers took power promising sovereignty and security, millions did not mourn the old order. They celebrated its end. The declaration from Bamako formalized what had already begun. Mali expelled French forces in 2022. Burkina Faso followed. Niger severed military agreements in 2023. One by one, the pillars of Western presence were dismantled, not through rebellion, but through state policy. And now, those same states are no longer acting alone. They formed the Alliance of Sahel States, a political and military bloc designed explicitly to replace Western partnerships with regional self-reliance and external alliances that don't come with conditions written in Paris or Washington. This is where the stakes become undeniable. The Sahel isn't just expelling foreign troops. It's rejecting the currency systems, trade agreements, and diplomatic hierarchies that kept it bound to Europe. It's signing security partnerships with Russia, exploring economic frameworks with China, and openly aligning with powers that Western strategy spent decades trying to contain. France isn't losing influence in a peripheral region. It's being systematically replaced in a zone it considered essential to its African footprint and its global posture. And France has not accepted this quietly. Paris condemned the coups, suspended aid, threatened sanctions, and rallied ECOWAS, the regional bloc it historically influenced, to isolate the junta-led states. But isolation requires unity, and that unity is fracturing. Senegal, once a pillar of French alignment, has begun recalibrating. Côte d'Ivoire is hedging. Even Nigeria, ECOWAS's heavyweight, has grown reluctant to enforce punitive measures that could destabilize its own northern border. The architecture of Western control in West Africa is not collapsing from external pressure. It's eroding from within. What makes this moment different from past confrontations is that Mali and Burkina Faso are not asking for reform. They're not seeking better terms within the existing system. They're building an alternative. Joint military commands, shared intelligence structures, plans for a regional currency independent of the CFA franc. These are not symbolic gestures. They are institutional foundations for a post-Western Sahel. You'll see why this matters beyond the region. If the Sahel successfully consolidates sovereignty and security without Western backing, it sets a precedent. It signals to other African states that the cost of defiance may be lower than the cost of compliance. It demonstrates that multipolarity isn't just a theory discussed in foreign policy journals. It's a lived reality, negotiated in Bamako, not Brussels. The West still holds economic leverage. It can restrict access to development finance, block technology transfers, complicate trade routes. But leverage is not the same as control. And control in the Sahel is no longer guaranteed. In November 2024, Turkey signed a mining agreement with Mali that did something Western powers spent decades refusing to do. It gave Mali majority ownership and control over its own gold. Not joint ventures with fine print. Not technical partnerships where profits flow north. Actual ownership. And with that signature, Ankara didn't just enter the Sahel. It redefined what foreign partnership could look like in a region conditioned to expect extraction. This wasn't charity. It was strategy. And it's working. While France watched its military bases close and its influence collapse across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, Turkey quietly moved in with a different model. No lectures about democracy. No conditions tied to governance reforms. No legacy of colonial occupation to defend. What Ankara offered was simple: security expertise, economic partnership, and respect for sovereignty. And in a region that had just expelled the West, that combination carried weight. Turkish military and intelligence specialists are now on the ground in Bamako, training Malian forces in counterterrorism, reconnaissance, and tactical coordination. These aren't advisors embedded within a Western command structure. They're operating under Malian authority, building capacity that answers to Bamako, not Brussels or Washington. It's a direct alternative to the framework France spent decades maintaining, and it's being implemented at a moment when Mali's government is explicitly rejecting any return to Western military presence. This is where the stakes shift beyond security. Turkey isn't just filling a gap left by France. It's positioning itself as the model for what post-Western partnership looks like. And that model is gaining traction not because Turkey is more powerful than the West, but because it's offering something the West historically didn't: partnership without paternalism. The Gold Agreement exemplifies this. Mali is one of Africa's largest gold producers, but for decades, the majority of revenue from that gold left the country. Foreign corporations held the licenses. Foreign banks processed the transactions. Malian communities near the mines saw pollution and displacement, but rarely prosperity. The new Turkish deal flips that structure. Mali retains majority profits. Turkey gets access, but not control. It's a framework that treats Mali as an economic partner, not a resource colony. You'll see why this matters to the broader region. Burkina Faso is watching. Niger is watching. So is Senegal, Guinea, and every other African state tired of signing agreements where sovereignty is negotiable and profits are guaranteed to leave. If Turkey's model succeeds in Mali, if it delivers both security and economic benefit without the political subordination that came with Western deals, it becomes a template. And that template directly threatens the economic architecture Europe has relied on for decades. Ankara understands this. Turkey has been expanding across Africa for years, building mosques, hospitals, schools, and trade networks in over 30 countries. It supplies armed drones to Niger and military training to Somalia. Turkish construction firms operate in nearly every major African capital. This isn't improvisation. It's a deliberate long-term strategy to position Turkey as a key non-Western power in a multipolar world. And the Sahel is emerging as the proving ground. What makes Turkey particularly effective in this space is what it doesn't carry. It has no colonial history in Africa. It's not part of NATO's operational command in the Sahel. It's not aligned with the IMF and World Bank frameworks that Sahelian governments increasingly view as tools of economic control. Turkey can offer military partnership without triggering the political baggage that comes with Western involvement. That's not a minor advantage. In the current Sahel, it's decisive. France has responded predictably. Paris has criticized Turkey's role, warned of destabilization, and framed Ankara's involvement as opportunistic interference. But those warnings land differently now. The Sahel isn't asking for France's approval. It's building alternatives. And Turkey is providing them faster and more pragmatically than any Western ally has been willing to. When Burkina Faso's military government publicly displayed Russian-made air defense systems in Ouagadougou in late 2024, it wasn't a parade. It was a message. The Sahel now possesses the hardware to shoot down aircraft, intercept strikes, and defend its airspace, not from jihadists, but from external powers that once operated with impunity. And the country that made that possible isn't in Europe or North America. It's Russia. Moscow has become the military backbone of the alliance of Sahel states, supplying advanced weapon systems, training special forces, and deploying tactical advisors across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. This isn't symbolic support. It's operational infrastructure designed to ensure that no foreign power can repeat what happened in Libya in 2011, when NATO airstrikes dismantled the government in weeks. The Sahel has studied that lesson, and it's made sure it won't be defenseless. Russia's entry into the region didn't begin with ideology. It began with necessity. When Mali expelled French forces in 2022, it faced an immediate security vacuum. Jihadist groups were expanding. Neighboring states were threatening intervention. Western allies were withholding equipment and intelligence. Bamako needed a partner willing to supply arms, train soldiers, and operate without political conditions. Moscow provided all three. The Wagner Group, later restructured under Russian state control as Africa Corps, became the visible face of this partnership. Russian contractors operated alongside Malian troops in counterinsurgency campaigns. They provided convoy security, protected mining sites, and trained forces in urban warfare tactics. But the deeper integration wasn't just boots on the ground. It was systems, radar networks, armored vehicles, attack helicopters, and anti-aircraft platforms that fundamentally altered the Sahel's defensive posture. This is where the strategic calculation becomes clear. Russia isn't in the Sahel to compete with jihadists. It's there to counter Western leverage. Every air defense battery Moscow delivers reduces the threat of foreign airstrikes. Every intelligence sharing agreement limits the effectiveness of external surveillance. Every arms shipment strengthens the Sahel's ability to resist pressure, whether that pressure comes as sanctions, blockades, or military threats. And in return, Russia gains access, influence, and a bloc of states willing to align with Moscow in global forums where votes matter. You'll see why this matters beyond military hardware. The Sahel's partnership with Russia is fundamentally altering the balance of power in West Africa. For decades, the implicit threat of Western military intervention shaped political calculations across the region. Leaders knew that if they crossed certain lines, French jets could be overhead within hours. That threat is now contested. Not eliminated, but contested. And in geopolitics, contested dominance is the first step toward lost dominance. France still has bases in neighboring states. The United States maintains drone operations in Niger, though access is increasingly restricted. But neither can operate with the confidence they once held. The risk of escalation has increased. The cost of intervention has risen. And the Sahel's governments, backed by Russian deterrence capabilities, are betting that Western powers will calculate those costs and choose not to act. This isn't ideological alignment. Mali's government hasn't adopted Russian political models. Burkina Faso isn't mimicking Moscow's governance. This is transactional pragmatism, rooted in survival, sovereignty, and the belief that multipolarity offers more protection than Western partnership ever did. Russia provides what the Sahel needs most, the means to defend its political choices without external approval. But there's a deeper implication here. If the Sahel successfully consolidates security with Russian backing, it establishes a precedent for other African states facing similar pressures. It signals that there are alternatives to Western security frameworks, and those alternatives come without governance conditions, human rights clauses, or diplomatic lectures. That's not just a shift in regional alignment. It's a structural change in how security partnerships are negotiated across the continent. Western officials have warned of Russian exploitation, resource extraction, and long-term dependency. Those warnings may prove accurate, but they're delivered by powers that spent decades extracting resources themselves, and the Sahel knows it. The difference now is that Moscow is offering deterrence, and deterrence is what keeps governments in power when external pressure mounts. In March 2024, China committed $4.7 billion to infrastructure development across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, more capital than the World Bank had allocated to the entire Sahel over the previous 5 years. Roads, railways, power grids, telecoms networks. Projects that don't just generate headlines, they generate sovereignty. And with that commitment, Beijing didn't just invest in the Sahel's future. It locked in its independence from the West. China is building the economic foundation that makes the Sahel's political rupture with Europe sustainable. Russia provides the military deterrence. Turkey offers the pragmatic partnerships. But China is constructing the infrastructure that transforms defiance into viability. And together, these three powers have created something the West never anticipated: a functional alternative to the post-colonial order that has governed Africa for 60 years. This isn't theoretical competition. It's operational replacement. Chinese firms are paving highways that connect landlocked Sahel states to Atlantic ports, bypassing routes controlled by pro-Western governments. They're building telecommunications infrastructure that reduces dependence on European satellite networks. They're financing energy projects that could, within a decade, make the region less reliant on imported fuel and foreign-controlled power grids. Every project China completes is a structural shift away from the economic leverage the West has historically used to enforce compliance. And Beijing isn't doing this out of altruism. It's securing access to critical minerals, lithium, rare earths, uranium, that define the next generation of global technology. It's expanding the Belt and Road Initiative into a region where Western institutions are collapsing. It's positioning itself as the indispensable partner for governments that have burned bridges with Paris, Washington, and Brussels. This is long-term strategic positioning, and it's being executed while Europe debates whether to continue engagement or enforce isolation. This is where the stakes escalate beyond the Sahel. What's emerging isn't just a regional realignment. It's a tripolar partnership model that could redefine how African states engage with global powers. Russia handles security and deterrence. Turkey manages immediate economic partnerships and military training. China builds the long-term infrastructure that makes independence permanent. Its division of labor, coordinated without formal alliance structures, but converging on a shared objective: displacing Western dominance. You'll see why this matters to the rest of the continent. Kenya is watching Chinese-built railways transform its trade capacity. Ethiopia is watching Turkish drones secure its borders. Tanzania is watching Russian energy partnerships develop. Every African government that has grown frustrated with IMF conditionality, World Bank delays, or Western political interference is now observing the Sahel and asking a simple question: what happens if we do the same? The West still holds financial leverage. The dollar remains the dominant reserve currency. European markets still absorb African exports. But leverage is not the same as monopoly, and monopoly in the Sahel is finished. The region has demonstrated that it's possible to expel Western military forces, reject Western economic frameworks, and survive, not in isolation, but through alternative partnerships that don't require political subordination. France has called this neo-colonialism under different flags. The United States has warned of debt traps and authoritarian influence. The European Union has threatened sanctions and aid cuts. But those warnings are losing potency. The Sahel's governments aren't asking for Western approval. They're building a different system, and that system is being constructed, literally, by Chinese engineering firms, secured by Russian defense contracts, and operationalized through Turkish trade agreements. What makes this moment historically significant is that it's not happening in one country. It's a bloc, 3 states acting in coordination, backed by 3 non-Western powers, creating a model that other African nations can study, adapt, and potentially replicate. If this model succeeds, the implications extend far beyond West Africa. It signals that multipolarity isn't an abstract concept debated in think tanks. It's a lived reality, negotiated in Bamako, financed in Beijing, and defended with systems supplied by Moscow. The West can still respond. It can offer better terms, reduce conditionality, match Chinese investment without political strings. But that would require abandoning the frameworks that have governed Western African relations since independence. And there's no indication that shift is coming. So the Sahel is moving forward without waiting. It's building roads the West wouldn't finance, signing defense agreements the West wouldn't permit, structuring economic partnerships the West wouldn't tolerate. And in doing so, it's transforming from a peripheral region into a central battleground in the contest that will define the 21st century. Whether the global order remains Western-dominated or whether it fractures into a multipolar system where influence is contested, sovereignty is non-negotiable and alternatives exist.